you said you built your first company for sure based on mimetic desire. Can you talk about why? Like what happened? Tell that story.
So my first company was in a way, it sounds very anti-mimetic, okay? Because my first company was not one of the traditional kinds of companies that people were starting. It wasn't a tech company. It was a healthy vending machine company.
Okay.
What we literally took the healthy alternative to junk food, pita chips, granola bars, things like that, and we put them into vending machines. We branded them in a really cool way. We put an LCD screen on them, and we put these in schools and hospitals and airports and office buildings. Meanwhile, everybody else was sort of starting tech companies. The genesis of that idea came from my cousin and I. I went to NYU. My cousin went to Columbia. And we just had, we were like workout fanatics. And there were so many times when we just wanted, a healthy snack on the go and we couldn't find something. And, we realized that how nice would it be to make healthy food more convenient. And then we sort of realized that we don't want to start a vending machine company. That doesn't seem very cool,
Yeah.
So, which is a mimetic sort of attitude in itself.
Right.
And it seemed like too big of a risk to take, I guess, at that time. So I just sort of like followed the money, went to work on Wall Street. I worked in investment banking for a little while and private equity. And, if I'm honest, I think that I was seeing some really cool friends sort of start companies in California. I mean, this is back in early 2005, right? So like, being a startup founder was not sort of like what it is today.
Right.
It was, things were just a little bit different back then. It wasn't like, seems like everybody's like, basically an entrepreneur these days, but back then, wasn't quite like that. But I sort of saw that and wanted, I wanted the freedom that I saw sort of associated with the kind of lifestyle that they were modeling to me. Here I am trapped at my desk, 80, 90, 100 hours a week. I'm basically a glorified secretary, and they were sort of modeling this sort of lifestyle of independence and creativity and autonomy.
Yeah.
In fact, it's not really like that, but that's sort of what I saw. So I quit, moved to California, started the company with my cousin. And, part of it was, part of the mimesis there was like, well, everybody else is starting this kind of a company, so I need to start a different kind of company. That's mimetic in and of itself, because you're sort of already basing the very kind of company you want to start based on what you see other people doing, and then deciding that you're going to do like either the opposite of them or something a little bit different, but you're still taking them as sort of a model of desire, right?
Right.
And that's the name that I give that is mirrored imitation. It's imitation, even though you're not imitating exactly, you're still sort of using them as a mirror to determine your own choices.
Right.
And that's very much what I did, without ever asking myself basic questions like, will I be happy running a vending machine company? Is this something that I want to do for the next 5 or 10 years? Do I even like the shit like that I'm putting in these machines?
Yeah. Would
I use it? The answer ended up being no to all of those questions. And that's why ultimately I decided to leave. And then within where it became really mimetic is like once we actually got started, there were crazy and my self-awareness at that time in my life being horrible. There were crazy sort of mimetic rivalries. I mean, between us as business partners, between like the little sort of circle that we ran in, insecurities like about, we're not growing very fast. Maybe we should have started a tech company after all. Seems like investors, are not attracted by the prospect of scaling vending machine distribution networks, and all of those things just sort of ended up consuming me to the point where I sort of like forgot why I'd started the company in the first place. And I think that oftentimes we have this hindsight bias where we tell stories about the reasons that we did things way after we did them.
Right.
And I had this sort of very romantic story about why I started that company. As most entrepreneurs do. But when I was radically honest with myself, I realized that none of the reasons for me starting that company had to do with any real, real understanding of the value that I thought this would bring to people. And had a lot more to do with, I think, me seeking a certain kind of identity as an entrepreneur.
Right.
Like the business itself almost came secondary to the identity seeking. And, you know, that is something, I mean, frankly, I see that a lot, where it's like I have, you know, sometimes I have students that are like, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be an entrepreneur. And I'm like, well, you know, normally that means like being an entrepreneur. Like I'm not quite even sure what that means. Like you normally, you know, come to that as a consequence of like seeing some problem that you want to solve, not acquiring some quality of being.
Right.
And I think that's sort of the, you know, it's the opposite way to do it. And that's the same way that I did it. And that's why I sort of recognize it in others when they, you know, especially the younger people that I teach and mentor.
Yeah. I just, you know, sometimes, yeah, I think it makes me feel naked. Like, I think what you're describing is very much my experience when you talk about the radical honesty with yourself. I think so many of my, yeah, and it's funny too. It can be deceptive because I like to think of myself as like a critical thinker. I like to think of myself as somebody who doesn't follow the crowd, who does things differently and all that stuff. But that's its own form of this behavior, to be like that, you know. And it's so funny that I really identify with a lot of what you're talking about. Of like, you know, for me, I've had so many ideas, whether it's, you know, this podcast or companies in the past or jobs or things like that you kind of don't find out until way later that or at least for me, I kind of like almost forgot myself in the process of doing stuff, where I'm like, I'm kind of forgetting Alex altogether. And it's more like wrapped up into this idea of like some identity that I'm chasing outside of myself, that I'm probably seeing other people doing, that I think looks cool or looks fulfilling or whatever. And it's pretty interesting to look back and see, like, if I'm really honest with myself, probably a ton of my really big life choices came from this idea of mirroring behavior, or even if it's going the opposite direction of people, it's still like the foundation is still based on like, what are other people doing? I'm going to do the opposite of that. It's still the same coin, you know? And I really resonate with that. And so that was your first company. You realize all those things. You realize this isn't fulfilling. This isn't actually what I want at all. When did that click for you? That like, I guess was it after that company that you started reading more from Gerard, and that you started seeing the pattern that you had kind of fallen into? Like what was the transition like from there?
Yeah, that was the beginning for me, but it didn't click for me right away. I mean, I still, you know, I think it just takes a long time to settle in, because it's not like learning this thing that instantly clicks. It's not like learning math. It's learning something. It's self-discovery, right? It's sort of like learning something about who we are, which that's the temptation, is to sort of like, I don't know, read a book, whether it's mine or whether it's Gerard himself, and then assume that we understand. The understanding is, knowledge is not enough, right? There's sort of, it has to become real, and it wasn't real for me right away. It took me a long time. Peter Thiel, by the way, describes the process of he's probably the most famous student of Rene Girard and mimetic theory, describes his journey in very much the same way. Like he intellectually understood it, but he didn't understand it at an existential level for years. And it was the same thing for me.
Yeah.
And that's, it's funny. I had conversations with my publisher and editor, and I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I really necessarily expect people to read this book. And I hope that they can't unsee mimetic desire, and I hope that they get haunted by it in a good way. But I don't necessarily know if it's going to be understood right away. Yeah, I think that's like something that you have to sort of like see in your own life. So yeah, I mean, it's not, so I wasn't like cured of my unhealthy mimetic desire. It took me years, I think. And I'm still, by the way, it's like, it's not a bad thing. Like mimetic desire can be a positive thing. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. It's just a part of human nature, right? And it's just a part of human nature that I think we don't necessarily like to acknowledge, because it means that we're somewhat, dependent creatures, and that, we are social, and that maybe we're not as independent as we think.
Yeah.
So, I've done a lot of things since then. Some, I think it's been a gradual progression towards having more self-possession, if that makes sense. Or sort of now I understand the things that are influencing me, and the motivations behind why I do some of the things that I do. And I think that's a fundamental question, right? It's like being honest with ourselves about what our real motivations are. And asking about motivations is, I think we just take our motivations for granted a lot of times, right? Yeah. And we don't actually like probe them and ask ourselves, are they healthy motivations, or are they the kinds of motivational drives that will only last for a couple of weeks or a month or a year? Because if you're starting a company, or you're, trying to create something that's enduring, you want to make sure that your motivation is also enduring. Like the motivation has to match your time frame,
right? In
a sense. So if the motivation is, for instance, to satiate a desire to sort of like match a rival, or to deal with your own insecurity, you always have to find like new ways to do that. And I think that doesn't really compare to like the motivation to, to build something enduring that isn't reliant on validation from any other one particular like person, is not reliant on sort of like being understood right away. And you see some people that have this sort of longer term vision, and they seem sort of very secure in what they're doing. That's a game changer, I think, to sort of get to a place as a creator, where we can do that, right? Yeah. Whether you're a writer or an artist or an entrepreneur. And that's sort of been the journey for me.